Good morning. Thanks, Isaac. It's a pleasure to have this opportunity to speak to you. You can stay in the book of Ruth because we have some lessons to learn from someone in their late 20s, early 30s who's still living with their parents. Can you learn something from somebody still living with their parents this late in their life? What did it say at the end of chapter 2? She lived with her mother-in-law, not just her parent, her mother-in-law, no less. Last time we looked at Ruth's family, and we looked at her family across the lifespan. Remember back in chapter 1, we just spent some time in the first 5 verses, and we saw in those little verses there, that short section, we see God sees and cares about the whole story that a family is in. Remember, they were a young family who sojourned into Moab in order to find food. And there was excitement and hope that this young family was going and experiencing. But what was the next phase of their life? Do you remember what happened to Ruth and her mother-in-law and her sister-in-law? First, Elimelech, the father and the patriarch, died, and then both of their husbands died. And you capture that image and you see a family that is now widowed and destitute and poor and hopeless. Just a few verses before, this family was full of hope, and now it seems as though there is no hope. But we fast forward to the end of the book, chapter 4, and we see that Ruth is now the great-grandmother of the king David, greatest king in the history of Israel, save for the king Jesus Christ, who was also in the lineage of Ruth. How can you have that kind of experience in one family? Because God in His omniscience sees the whole family, and He wants to redeem those who are true to Him. This is a story of redemption. This is also a story of love. I want to draw your attention to chapter 2, verse 20. Now, Naomi is grief-stricken in much of this book, and she doesn't always give advice that upon further reflection is the most logical or the most correct. However, she gives us an important indication here about this book. Verse 20 in chapter 2. And Naomi said to her daughter-in-law Ruth, "May he, Boaz, who is of kin," right? That's a good southern term. That's my kin, right? Live up the road over yonder, right? This is kin, a relative of Naomi, of Elimelech. "May he, Boaz, be blessed by the Lord, whose kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead." Naomi is saying, may Boaz be blessed by God. God's kindness has not forsaken the living or the dead. This Hebrew word here for kindness, this isn't just, oh, somebody gave me a cupcake and that was kind, right? This isn't just the fluffy kind of kindness. This word right here is the highest expression of love that we get in the Old Testament. And it occurs over 240 times in the Old Testament. Sometimes it is translated as mercy, sometimes as grace, more often as loving kindness, steadfast love, favor. So as we read through the story of Ruth and we see the challenges and the blessings that they face, Naomi realizes whatever is going on, God is expressing His highest status of love toward this family. Another usage over in Lamentations chapter 3. How can there be anything happy in a book called Lamentations? But yet we sing this song, chapter 3, verse 22. "The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul. Therefore I will hope in Him." That steadfast love, that loving kindness, even when God's people do not love Him, His love is greater. And Naomi figures that out here in verse 20. She says, may Boaz be blessed by God because God has really been kind to us all along. Now, as we read through chapter 1, we'll see she doesn't always believe that. So I said all that to say this. This is a story about love. It would be very simple to pick popular songs from today, popular movies that deal with love, and to say, look, the kind of love that the popular world shows us is really foolish. It's all self-gratifying. It's all about, oh, gee, I didn't get what I wanted, so I'm going to write this really sad song and then make millions of dollars after publishing this song, right? We could take all of that and make that point, but that's easy, right? How about the love stories written by some of the greatest writers of humankind, right? Shakespeare wrote a tragic love story. He's considered to be one of the greatest English writers of all time. He wrote a tragic love story, and he called it Romeo and Juliet. Do you remember the premise? You have these two warring families who are standing against each other, and out of these two warring families, what do you get? More children who hate each other? Well, mostly. But then you get Romeo and Juliet who love each other. And this whole play, it's so big that if you try and look it up online, they can't even post it on one page because it would take too long to load. And so they have to put each act on a different page. It's a really long story about this single relationship. Here are the first few stanzas. You may remember this from your high school or college English classes. Two houses, both alike in dignity, in fair Verona where we lay our scene. From ancient grudge break to new mutiny, where civil blood makes civil hands unclean. From forth the fatal loins of these two foes, a pair of star-crossed lovers take their life. Star-crossed lovers. Two individuals who love each other so much, and yet it seems like the fates, the stars even, keep crossing their paths, saying, you will not be together. That's the intrigue of our romance stories together, right? These two people who just want to be together, and yet somehow they manage to mess that up. Shakespeare is about the status of their relationship, and it is a love story, but it's a tragedy, because what happens in the end? One of the greatest love stories ever written, what happens in the end? The relationship never happens. They both die. And it's considered a tragedy because they don't get what they want. Shakespeare wrote a love story and called it Romeo and Juliet. The Lord wrote a love story inspired by true events, and we call it the book of Ruth. Listen to some phrases from the book of Ruth and tell me if you see a difference here. And Naomi said, see, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law. But Ruth said, do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God shall be my God. The Lord takes the story of an outcast widow clinging to her impoverished and grief-stricken mother-in-law, but rather than looking at the status of their relationship, he looks at the substance of their heart. The greatest love stories written by man are still focused about the status of a relationship. If you don't get what you want, then it's a tragedy in the end. Not so with God. He is concerned with the substance of people's hearts. Without taking anything away from Shakespeare, I want to look at the masterpiece that the Lord gives us in the life of Ruth. A couple things we'll look at. First of all, Ruth figures out that the love of the Lord and the pain of life can coexist. She goes through life, and her life is really hard, and yet she doesn't doubt that God loves her. Ruth also learns that she can't just give in to every immediate desire that she has. She can't just give in to the things that she sees that she desires that would be good for her. That there is a blessing in postponing gratification for the better thing that God has. She also figures out that she has to give up what her idea of peace and security is. She has this idea about what is going to make her secure, and she has to give that up. She learns that love and pain coexist. She learns that she cannot give in to immediate desires and that she must give up what she thinks is the right answer. This is really important for us because if we want to learn how to love our families and our neighbors and even strangers, then we have to learn to love God. And we have to learn love from God. Ruth chapter 2, verse 20. Remember what I said about love not always being a cupcake. Love not always being a walk in the park. Notice what Naomi says in chapter 2, verse 20. God's kindness has not forsaken us. What does Ruth say? What does the book of Ruth say in chapter 1, verse 1? In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. How can you start a love story off with a famine? How can God be loving His people through a famine? The Lord's kindness toward this family and toward His people is a different kind of love than perhaps we're accustomed to. Sometimes our young people, or when Nathan gets older, he'll do something right, and I'll maybe reward him for that. I'll give him something that is good, okay? But then someday, I'm sure it's going to happen, though. I hope it doesn't. He breaks curfew, right? Never going to happen, okay? He breaks curfew when he comes home. Do I give him something for that? What do I give him? Yeah, not the cupcake, but you give them the discipline that they need. Is that not loving him if I discipline him or I ground him or I do whatever I'm supposed to do? Isn't that a form of love? That's what's going on here. This isn't some sporadic famine that's going on. Read Deuteronomy 28 and Deuteronomy 30. God loves His people not by giving them what they want, but by being faithful to the covenant that He established with them. When His people don't return love to God, when His people spurn Him and reject Him, His love is greater than that, and He disciplines them. In this case, He disciplines them through this famine that they encounter. There's that cliche out there that the God of the Old Testament is not a God of love, that He's angry and that He barges around and that He's just wrathful and really mean, and that there's no grace, there's all judgment. What does Jonah accuse God of in Jonah chapter 4? Do you remember Jonah's accusation? He actually uses the same high expression of love that we see in the book of Ruth. Jonah says in Jonah 1 verse 2, or Jonah chapter 4 verse 2, he says, Jonah prayed to the Lord and said, O Lord, is not this what I said when I was in my country? This is why I made haste to flee from Tarshish, for I knew that you are a gracious God and a merciful God, slow in anger and abounding in steadfast love and relenting from disaster. Therefore now, O Lord, please take my life from me, for it is better for me to die than to live. Maybe one of the most successful prophets and preachers ever. He converted a whole city with one sermon, and he says, God, you are too gracious. You love too much. And we come back to the book of Ruth, which is all about the love of God. God's love is greater than ours. Read through the first couple of verses of Ruth again. She lost her father-in-law. She lost her husband. She was left as a widow. She was left as destitute. God really must not love her. That's not the case at all. Love and pain are not exclusive. They coexist, and they condition each other, and they refine each other. And the poverty and the loss that Ruth is subjected to pushes her closer to God. Ruth chapter 1, verse 6. Then Naomi arose with her daughters-in-law to return to the country of Moab, for she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited His people and given them food. So she set out from the place where she was with her two daughters-in-law, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. So they hear that there's food, that God is blessing His people again. And so they go there. They hear that there's food in the fields. So what if there's food in the fields? I know that there's food in the grocery store. Can I just walk in and take whatever I would like? What do I have to get the food that I know is in the grocery store? Either they have to be giving it away, which last time I checked, that's not how you stay in business, or you better have something to offer in exchange for that. So what if there's food in the fields of Judah? What good is it to these destitute widows who have no land and who have no way of earning money? God really must not love them. Leviticus chapter 19. Right here in the mess of all of these laws that convince us that God is harsh and obsessed with sacrifice and must not love his people. Leviticus 19 verse 9. When you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not reap your field right up to its edge, neither shall you glean the gleanings after your harvest. You shall not strip your vineyard bare, neither shall you gather the fallen grapes of your vineyard. You shall leave them for the poor and for the sojourner. I am the Lord your God. He's saying when you reap your fields, when you go and you gather what you have worked hard for, first of all, you're not going to get everything. Whatever falls out as you're gathering, don't go pick it up. That's not for you. That's for the poor and the destitute and the sojourner. And up against the sides of your field, don't glean that. Don't take that. That's for the poor and the destitute and the sojourner. Keep reading with me here in Leviticus, because notice what it says, the purpose behind all of these laws. Leviticus 19 verse 11, you shall not steal, you shall not deal falsely. Leviticus 19:13, you shall not oppress your neighbor or rob him. Leviticus 19:15, you shall do no injustice in court. Leviticus 19:17, you shall not hate your brother in your heart, but you shall reason frankly with your neighbor, lest you incur sin because of him. You shall not take vengeance or bear a grudge against the sons of your own people. Now listen to this, because this sounds an awful lot like the New Testament to me. But you shall love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. You want to know where they got that verse? You shall love your neighbor as yourself? They got it from Leviticus. You shall love your neighbor and the stranger and the destitute and the sojourner by not taking everything that's in your field, but by leaving it for them. You see, even in Ruth's loss and in her pain and in her suffering, God has already provided a way for her to come back and to find him. He doesn't do this by giving her a handout, but he gives her a hand up, because she still has to go work in that field. We start to realize loss and pain and poverty, when viewed as Ruth views them, actually prepare Ruth to the Lord. Who is this love story about, anyway? We haven't even gotten to Boaz yet. Might this be about something beyond two people seeking each other, and rather a person seeking their Lord? The love of the Lord and the pain of life can go together. And when we fail to realize the relationship between pain and growth and maturity in our life, I'd like to read this here. Just here is the reason for the failure of many relationships, for frustrations and torture, yes, even shallowness and shipwreck of many a marriage, to think that love can grow and live without suffering. None of us has this muscle or this bone, like the endurance bone. Anyone have that bone somewhere in your body? Or the patience muscle? Do you have that, right? That just really makes you very, very, very patient? I'd like to get a transplant or see something about a grafting if you have that. There's no way to grow the bone of endurance or the muscle of patience without what? Without exercising it. Without suffering and enduring loss. Not that these things are joyful, but it is the accepting of the circumstances and finding a way through it. Learning to live with the loss and the suffering in our life and drawing closer to God. Ruth accepts the circumstances and she finds a way through it. The pain propels her closer to God. Ruth chapter 1, come on down into verse 8. Naomi says to her daughters-in-law, "Go, return each of you to her mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find rest, each of you in the house of her husband." Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. And they said to her, "No, we will return with you and to your people." Now Naomi is set with the task of providing for her daughters-in-law, right? But what does she tell them to go do? Return to your mother's house in Moab. Each of you return to the house of a husband. What is so special about Moab? I mean, can't they go to Judah? Well, back in Moab is family, and you can see the family. You can see what is going to provide security. There's also available men in Moab, and they know that, and they can see that. It comes to the question of, do I give in to what I can see, or do I wait for the better thing that God is going to provide? Do I give in to an immediate desire, and do I walk by sight, or do I walk by faith? It's really odd what she says here. She says, return to your mother's house. The Lord has dealt kindly with you, or may He deal kindly with you. This is that kindness, that everlasting love. May He deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. And then she says this, may the Lord grant you rest. Where? By finding a house of a husband back in Moab. God will deal kindly with you by leaving and going away from God. If you go to Moab, there's almost a guaranteed husband there, and there's guaranteed security in the house of your mother. It's right there. It's that cheap necklace that the kid sees in the party section of the store. I can have that cheap necklace now, or I can wait for the greater gift of the pearl necklace that my mother is going to give me later. You can steal this, and you can have this, and you can reach out and gratify your desires now. You can give into that and totally miss out on the good things that God has waiting for you in His plan. To their credit, both of them decide to not gain pleasure. They decide to go on with the suffering of being lonely. But Naomi pushes them again. Verse 11. Naomi said, turn your back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb, that they may become your husbands? She knows that if they go back to Judah, if they go back to where God's people are, they're going to have to marry somebody who is next of kin. We'll talk about that more when we talk about Boaz in our next lesson. But the law said that the only person you can marry once you're in God's people is a kin, which really changes things for being, if you're a brother. My brother goes to school in Searcy, right? And he's single now, and he's about to finish up his degree. But if before I had Nathan, when I was married to Jenny, if we would have been Israelites and something would have happened to me, in order to preserve the family name, guess what my brother would have had to do? He would have had to take Jenny and his wife and continue on the family name, to preserve the property and the name and the land, and also to provide for a widow who would have been destitute. So, am I my brother's keeper? That had some really serious consequences for brothers back in the time of Judah. But I say all that to say, going back to Judah, it was very likely that they were going to be single and alone and impoverished for the rest of their lives. She says, look, I can't have kids now. Even if I have kids now, that's 9 months, and then it's going to be another 15, 20 years before they get old enough. You can't wait that long. The only security you have is finding another man. The only way you can be happy is to be married. The only way you can be happy is to find a relationship that will make you full. That's what Naomi says. Is that what God says? Is that God's message, that the only way you can be happy is by finding someone else? That the only security you can find is in an institution or with another person? Naomi has boxed in the possibilities, and she has said, the only way you can be happy is to be married. Ruth gets it. Notice what Ruth says. We read it before, but I want to read it again. Verse 16. Do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. Where you go, I will go. Where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God will be my God. There's no relationship, there's no marriage, there's no other individual who will ever gratify for us or provide for us the greatest needs of our heart. Amen. It's only in God. And you know as well as I do, there's plenty of people who are married and they haven't learned this lesson of giving up their idea of perfection and security for God's idea. And these people who don't know how to give up, who don't know how to give up me for we, who don't know how to give up mine for ours. These people are married, but they're amongst the most lonely people, even as they are married. So you can still be lonely, even if you're connected to someone, if you haven't learned to give up your idea of security and give in to what God would have for your life. Insisting on mine, you'll be lonely whatever relationship you're in. If you give up for God, there is no loneliness when you pursue and you seek God. I want to close. Ruth has taken this amazing journey of love, and she knows that pain is necessary for life. And boy, I've got a lot to learn about pain being necessary in life. And she realizes, don't give in to those things that are right in front of you. Wait for the better things that God has in store for you. All right, God's loving kindness is greater than just circumstances and what's in front of you. And the third part was give up your idea of what you think perfection and security is. You got to find it in God, and you got to pursue God. It's not the status of your relationship, it's the substance of your heart. But for all of Ruth's love, for all of the wonderful things that she has done and all the giving that she has done, how does she see herself? Verse 10 of chapter 2. Ruth fell on her face, bowing to the ground, and she says to Boaz, "Why have I found favor in your eyes that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner?" She's the one expressing all of the righteous and godly love in this story, and she still sees herself as a lowly, foreign Moabite person. No, come on down in verse 13. She says, "I have found favor in your eyes, my lord, Boaz, for you have comforted me and spoken kindly to your servant, though I am not one of your servants." She does the right thing even when she doesn't see herself as God does. She does the right thing because she realizes that no amount of love is going to get her into the salvation of God. What does Ruth still lack at the end of the book? For all of the love that she demonstrates, she still lacks a redeemer. The same is true for us today. No one can love God perfectly. No one can cling to Him unwaveringly. Even in Ruth's display of God-like love, she still needs a Redeemer. We're not saved by how much we love, but by how much our Redeemer loved us and still loves us. And only by learning to love God and learning love from God can we truly love others. I have plenty of friends and family and acquaintances who don't have a personal relationship, who don't know God, who don't accept the way God does things. They might love better than I do. They may treat their family better than I do. But you don't get to heaven merely based upon how much you love. Because at some point we all make mistakes. And we all need the Redeemer, just like Ruth needed her Redeemer. It wasn't the status of her relationship, it was the substance of her heart. And when she threw herself into the arms of her God, she found peace. Shakespeare wrote about two lovers seeking each other. God tells us about people seeking God and finding each other along the way. May that be who we are today. The plea today is that you would join us as a church in seeking God. We can't promise that there's not going to be pain in your life. We can't promise that all of your relationships are suddenly going to click and everything's going to be wonderful. But you can join us as we march toward God, as we learn to appreciate His loving kindness, the discipline, and the mercy. If you need to return to the family of God and seek forgiveness, or if you need to be joined with Him in baptism today, come forward. Let's stand and sing together.